imperialism, colonialism, slavery almost certainly wasn't the factor that made the West rich. And it fails on a fairly basic level, this idea.
Britain is often accused by Indian nationalists of having exploited India, impoverished India. There's this ridiculous figure that gets touted of India accounting for 25% of world GDP, ignoring the fact that it's 25% of the population, therefore reduced by 1%.
It wasn't empire, it wasn't slavery, because those things had been around for millennia. In fact, it was the very opposite of that. It wasn't exploitation, it was liberation.
I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this evening's event. How Britain and other Western nations became rich is a topic of significant debate, both inside and outside of academia. One area of particularly fierce disagreement is over the role of empire in the slave trade in the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century. Was colonialism a marginal distraction that enriched a few at the expense of the taxpayer, or a key component in the creation of economic growth? And beyond this, what were the economic consequences for the parts of the world which were colonised? Tonight's discussion will proceed as follows. Each member of the panel will be given an introduction and then 5 minutes to set out their position. This will be followed by 20 minutes of discussion between the panelists, which I will moderate. After that, there will be 20 minutes of audience Q&A. Right, with that clear, I'm now very pleased to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Kristian is the IEA's Editorial Director and also, interestingly enough, the IEA's longest-serving member of staff, having arrived here as an intern in 2006 and become an employee in 2008. He has been, in this time, the author of numerous papers and books, including this one, Imperial Measurement, a Cost-Benefit Analysis of Western Colonialism, which inspired this event and is on sale at the back for the low price of £5. So I hope all of you take that opportunity to get it half price. So, Kristian, thank you for joining us. You now have 5 minutes to set out your stall.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you all for coming. Good evening. I was initially going to talk about the publication itself, but then I thought maybe it makes more sense to go several steps further back and ask, why does this even matter? Why does any of this matter? It's 2024. Why are we talking about the old empire? It's not self-evident that it matters. In fact, on the day this report came out, I was on Times Radio where the interviewer, Matt Chorley, wasn't very happy with it. So not because of anything that I said, but because I had written it at all. He said, well, why are you doing this? You could have written something on how to sort out the NHS. You could have written something on how to sort out the housing crisis. Instead, you're doing this. You're fueling a culture war. And he said, you're just doing this to wind up The Guardian. But I would say it kind of does matter, because let's put it this way. Think of the economy of Dubai. Dubai is a very rich place, right? It's a place that we associate with luxury shopping and glitzy stuff. Nonetheless, despite the fact that they are rich, I've never heard anyone say that we should try to learn from the economic model of Dubai. Never heard anyone say that we should try to learn from their economic policies or their institutions. Why not? Why does nobody say that? Well, it's because in the case of Dubai, we don't attribute their success to any of those factors. We don't see that as an economy that does anything particularly well. We think of it as an oil-rich economy. And in economic terms, we think of this as almost a form of cheating. We think, well, if you're rich because you have oil, then it doesn't really count. It means that there's nothing to be learned from you. You just got lucky. And if you take the standard Guardian view of the Industrial Revolution, of the economic rise of Britain and the Western world, that is more or less how you will think about that. You will see that as a form of cheating, as an economy that, or a group of economies that got rich, not because they did things right, not because they had particularly good institutions or policies, but as economies that just got rich because they cheated. And if that's how you see the sources of the West's economic success, then, well, you're not going to develop much of an appreciation for the economic system which made all that possible. If anything, quite the reverse. You may even develop a resentment against that system because you will see it as a system of plunder and exploitation, and you will not see that as a model that is in any way worth emulating or learning from. It would be, yes, you can get rich in that way, in the way that the mafia can get rich, in the way that a criminal gang can get rich, but that doesn't mean that that's a model that anyone can learn anything from. So it does matter to disentangle these factors and to scrutinize these ideas that this is indeed what made the Western world rich. The short answer is imperialism, colonialism, slavery almost certainly wasn't the factor that made the West rich. First of all, there's the fact that overseas trade in general was far less important for the economy then than it is today, for obvious reasons. It's simply because the technologies that we use today, that sustain trade today, were not invented until much later. So container shipping only became a thing in the 1950s. So even relative to the size of the economy, overseas trade far less important then. And even then, most of that trade wasn't with the colonies for most of the period, but with other industrializing economies, most of them nearby. And again, for totally obvious reasons. To this day, the Netherlands are a more important trading partner for Britain than India, despite the fact that India is so much larger. Why? Well, because the Netherlands are nearby and they're rich. So it makes perfect sense to trade more with them. And then, of course, if Britain traded more outside of the empire than within it, that also raises the question, to what extent do you even need an empire for trade? So Britain did trade with places that it never colonized, and in some cases even with places that were colonized by other imperial powers. Brazil was a trading partner both when they were a Portuguese colony and when they were an independent republic later on, so this does raise the question, do you even need an empire? It may have some gains, but then there's also the cost, of course, to consider. Britain was a high-tax economy by the standards of the time, high military expenditure, because an empire of that size doesn't administer itself. And all in all, if we take it all together, did the empire make economic sense? Well, we can't be totally sure because we don't know what the alternative would have been. But if you compare it to a counterfactual of free trade and using all those resources that went into defending the empire for other things, for domestic consumption and investment, then compared to that counterfactual, Britain would probably have been better off without being a colonial, empire. And that is not what made this country or the wider Western world rich. And that means the West did actually get things right, and it is worth asking, what was that, and how do we build on that? How do we make those institutions, those policies even better? That is a question worth asking. But nonetheless, Matt Chorley from Times Radio was right about one thing. I am also trying to wind up the Guardian.
Good point. Okay, thank you, Kristian, for that introduction. Our second panelist is Dr. Lawrence Goldman. Lawrence is a historian and emeritus fellow at St. Peter's College, Oxford. He taught British and American history for 3 decades and was the convener of the history faculty's special subject on slavery and emancipation in the United States. From 2004 to 2014, he was the director of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography and is now the executive editor of History Reclaimed. In probably the highlight of his career, he is going to soon be on Radio 4's In Our Time episode, where he'll be discussing the life and career of Benjamin Disraeli. And he agreed to come on today saying, quote, this will be an excellent warm-up. So thank you. I'm very glad we can be such a brilliant warm-up. Lawrence, you have 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you. Well, Melvin and I have met several times before. This is our 12th meeting. But in fact, I have to tell you, because there's an election on, the BBC have said, oh, Disraeli, Conservative Party, 19th century perhaps, oh, but it might influence the voters. So we're putting it in the can tomorrow afternoon, and you probably won't hear it till September. But anyway, Disraeli will eventually reach your ears in our time. In a sense, I can't really follow Kristian here. He said everything that needed to be said, and he's written it in his wonderful pamphlet here, which I have very much enjoyed reading. In some ways, I find this evening rather strange. We shouldn't be meeting here and discussing this, because so much of this was worked out by historians in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Hearing Kristian speak just now reminded me of my supervisions in Cambridge in the 1970s, when much of this was discussed, home demand versus foreign demand in the Industrial Revolution and so forth. So I thought I would just alter my remarks and say something about historiography, how, as it were, we've written this history and what the problem is, because in a sense we've written this history properly already, but bad ideas keep coming back, and we're in a phase when bad ideas have returned. And as Kristian says, they do appear in The Guardian. I put something on the History Reclaimed website. Will Hutton wrote something really very ignorant. He's not a bad man, but he is ignorant on this subject. And like Kristian, I found myself at odds with The Guardian. 2 points, really, or 2 theses that need dealing with. We haven't talked much about slavery so far. So some of you will, I'm sure, have heard of the Williams thesis, Eric Williams's book, published long ago in 1944, Capitalism and Slavery, which came out of an Oxford doctorate. And he put slavery at the heart of industrialisation, arguing that emancipation in 1833 in the British Empire only occurred when slavery ceased to be profitable. And at that point, when more could be made through industrialisation and through investment in British industries, it was, as it were, meet and proper, or it was simply an available decision to get rid of slavery in the British Empire. And he also argued that industrialisation was financed through the profits of slavery, that, as it were, industrialisation depended upon the expropriation of the slaves. And historians through the 60s and 70s and 80s put this idea, these theses, to bed. They showed that, in fact, slavery was very profitable in the Caribbean in the 1820s, that owners were still making, sadly, a great deal of money out of slavery and sugar. They, of course, argued that emancipation was never a prudential decision based upon a cost-benefit analysis, but it was the result of 50 years, a half-century of campaigning on moral grounds to end slavery. And when the Whigs were finally elected or came into power at the end of 1830, emancipation became a reality. They argued as well that the capital formation that was crucial to the Industrial Revolution was not, as it were, the product of slave profits channeled through British banks and into British industries. From the 1760s and the 1770s, a quite different economy, a provincial economy, essentially a nonconformist economy. In other words, not an Anglican economy, but nonconformist communities, sharing capital through family relationships and friendships and so forth, in very small ways. This was how capital formation began the Industrial Revolution. Now, of course, later on, without question, some of the proceeds of slavery, particularly compensation payments made to slaveholders in 1833, found their way into industrial developments. I was with a historian in Liverpool a couple of weeks ago having dinner, and he was talking about those Liverpool slave owners and what they did with compensation payments. And they did indeed put it into the railway boom in the early 1840s. No surprise, perhaps. But if the argument is somehow slavery was the cause of the Industrial Revolution, then that isn't the case, because we have to go back to the 1760s and the 1770s. One final point, and this I think gels well with Kristian's arguments. If you just look at the demography for a moment, you can see the problem with the argument that slavery is somehow fundamental to industrialization. In 1830, there were about 14,000 whites on the island of Jamaica. Most of the owners, of course, were absentee owners. They lived in Britain. There were, of course, 300,000 slaves as well. But slaves hardly consume much. The food is produced locally. They're not great consumers of British industrial goods. And the whites, even though they might be conspicuously consuming, hardly at 14,000, compare with the millions in the developed parts of Europe, the Baltic, Western Europe, the Mediterranean lands, even the Ottoman lands, and of course the United States, who are really taking British goods. It's very difficult to make an argument that trade, certainly consuming British manufactured goods with the slave economy, is very great. And of course, although we all know the importance of sugar, the facts and figures of the British economy show that so many other commodities are more important. Will Hutton in The Guardian guffawed at the idea that wool was more important than colonial products. But of course it was more important. 350,000 people were employed in the worsted industry in Yorkshire alone in the mid-19th century, and wool, as it had been in the medieval period, remained crucial to the economy. So I've probably said enough, and I've decided to talk about slavery in particular. But as I say, these debates have been had and the work has been done, and it's rather depressing that we're back here again this late discussing subjects that, as it were, I discussed when I was an undergraduate.
Thank you, Lawrence. Our third speaker is Dr. Victoria Bateman. Victoria is an economic historian and fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She has 20 years' experience of teaching the Industrial Revolution at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, and she is also the author of The Sex Factor, how, I'll give you a moment to, available at all good bookshops, How Women Made the West Rich, which, if you're interested in learning more about that, even before you buy the book, one of my colleagues, Reem Ibrahim at the IEA, interviewed Victoria last September on the topic, and so that conversation is available on our website and on YouTube. So, Victoria, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me this evening. And I'd like to start with a question. And that is, what was the first empire in history? Now, it wasn't the British Empire, and it wasn't even the Roman Empire. It was actually the Akkadian Empire. It was the 3rd millennium BC. The great ruler, was Sargon of Akkad, and his city Akkad is so mysterious that archaeologists haven't yet been able to identify it. But nevertheless, despite us not being able to find the capital of this empire was great, and it spanned the whole of Mesopotamia. And that includes much of modern-day Iraq, for example. Now, to put it in context, 3rd millennium BC, this is the time of the Bronze Age. And probably one of the top bronze-producing economies in the world at the time was modern-day Turkey, so north of Mesopotamia, in a region that historians refer to as Anatolia. Now, the problem if you are a bronze producer at that time is you need two things, copper and tin. Now, copper was more widely available than was tin. But for those Anatolian bronze makers to get their hands on tin, they needed someone who could go all the way to places like Afghanistan in Central Asia and join the dots between Turkey and Central Asia. And the Mesopotamians were the people that did that. So the Sumerians, one of the first great civilizations in history, built their economy on trade. And it was one of the most urbanized places, well, probably the most urbanized place in the world at the time. And of course, the prosperity that was built on this trade, on trading tin over the ocean from Central Asia, often via the Indian coastline, up the Persian Gulf, and then either by trading caravan or by river, up through modern-day Iraq to Turkey. The prosperity that created was too tempting for Sargon of Akkad, and so he had to conquer his neighbours and reach out into Syria and up towards Anatolia. Now, I'm afraid history ever since has been one empire after another. So, we could go on to the Babylonians, Hammurabi, probably the big man, and he is Mr. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, invented the infamous law code. A little later we have the Assyrians, a little later we have those pesky Persians, and of course the ancient Greeks know a great deal about their archenemy, the Persians, and it's the rivalry between the Persian Empire and the ancient Greeks that gave rise to probably the first great naval battle in history, the Battle of Salamis, that in turn, when the Greeks snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, standing up to the Persian Empire, they celebrated that by erecting the Parthenon, Athens having been burnt to the ground by the Persian Empire. And then we trot on in history to the Roman Empire, and after the fall of that, to the Byzantine Empire. So the Roman Empire 2.0 that reestablishes itself not around Rome, but around Constantinople. By then, economic activity is shifting back towards the Middle East, the original cradle of civilization. We have the rise of the Islamic world. We have the Umayyads and the Abbasid Empire, built an empire greater than anything seen before, and at a time when much of Europe was within the midst of what we used to call the Dark Ages. And what did Europeans trade for all the riches of the Muslim world? European women. So enslaved European women. And in fact, many an Abbasid caliph was born of a slave woman in the harem of the Muslim rulers at that time. So we have the great Islamic empires, and then we have the Mongols who reach out from Mongolia as far as Baghdad, the Mughals in India. We have the Incas over in the Americas, and that's even before we've got to the modern-day European empires. And hey, I've missed out a lot of other empires along my tour of imperial history there. I'm sure you can fill in the dots. But the point of this is really to say empire, slavery, warfare, conquest, and what more generally we might reduce down to exploitation, coercion and control have sadly been the mainstay of history for millennia. History is one very long, one very dark tunnel. And so what is it that made Britain different? What is it that meant that Britain, unlike economies before, was able to have an industrial revolution, to produce modern economic growth, a sustained economic growth through which economies can grow year on year on year, creating a widespread shared prosperity for us all? What is it that drove that? It wasn't empire, it wasn't slavery, because those things had been around for millennia. In fact, it was the very opposite of that. It wasn't exploitation, it was liberation. Now, that is not to say, of course, that exploitation didn't feature and that it doesn't feature today, because, of course, it still does. And, there is a lot of exploitation throughout British history, and as I say, still sadly in parts of the economy today. Human trafficking, for example, is a long-standing problem. But and actually what we should, I think, say is that whilst slavery and empire really were not what drove the Industrial Revolution and the rise of Britain to the top of the economic rankings, were not what caused that. What they did do was a great deal of damage to those that were conquered and those that were part of the empire. And actually, Nathan Nunn, for example, an economic historian, has estimated that the gap in income today between Africa and the rest of the world, that 72% of that gap would have been closed, wouldn't be here, were it not for the history of slavery and colonialism. So there is an asymmetry there in the sense that just because it didn't help the British economy doesn't mean that it didn't do terrible things to other economies. So exploitation really, it wasn't key, it was liberation, and hence that is, right in the ballpark of my work, which looks particularly at how liberties that women were offered are half of the population after all, how looking at the liberties in women's lives, how through that we can understand the rise of the British economy.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. Very interesting. We'll get into more of that in the sort of discussion. Our final speaker is Dr. Zareer Masani, who is a writer and a broadcaster. He's also the author of Macaulay, Britain's Liberal Imperialist, on the great Victorian historian and statesman Thomas Babington Macaulay. This book was released in 2013, and at the time it received a very positive review from The Observer, which described it as an engaging biography which is mercifully devoid of 21st century judgmentalism. The same review goes on to describe Macaulay, the great colonialist, as a man who staked his reputation on creating a more egalitarian legal system for India, which has stood the test of time. Indeed, 150 years later, it is praised for its enlightenment and durability. The Observer's editorial line on Macaulay and 21st century judgmentalism has shifted quite a bit in the last 10 years. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. You have 5 minutes.
Right. Well, I will start by picking up on Victoria's point about women's rights, because I think some of you will know that the British Empire, certainly in India, liberated Indian women from the custom of sati, which was immolation of widows. It also freed widows to remarry. It banned female infanticide. It did what it could without disrupting the social system to advance women's rights. So I think that was certainly a positive in the Raj. I would argue that empire has been a two-way process, and I don't think one can really... I'm very impressed by Dr. Niemietz's work in terms of quantifying the economic impact, which I think is, very authoritative. I would argue that there's also been a huge cultural impact both ways. And I think Britain today, with its openness to the rest of the world, with its multiculturalism, etc., would not exist as it does without empire. I think it's true of the English language, it's true of British food, notably. So I think there are lots of ways in which empire culturally affected the British world. And then coming on to slavery, you could argue that certainly the world of Jane Austen was very much, a product of the wealth that slavery had brought in some respects. I'd like to sort of mention the fact that an example of how economically it could be two ways, because we all know that it all began in India with the East India Company, which exported Indian manufactures and imported them into the British market. So it had a stake in the Indian economy, and it paid for those exports from India by bringing bullion from Britain. So if anything, there was a drain of bullion from Britain to India where it was spent and which stimulated local economic activity. So one can't see that as in any way as a sort of one-way traffic, and it would be very hard to quantify given the sort of parameters then. Now, I would argue that I don't think trade, I agree with Professor Niemietz, that I don't think trade had any effect on the Industrial Revolution. That would have been marginal. And I think it was much more to do with what Lawrence has mentioned, to do with the traditions of the Reformation, savings, capital formation, mercantilism. There was also the impact of exploration, people traveling the world, the transport links that developed, and of course Britain's naval power and the fact that Britain controlled the seas, which again was the product of several centuries and had very little to do with empire. So I think those things would be very hard to quantify, but there were factors. And I think, again, it wasn't a zero-sum game, because Britain is often accused by Indian nationalists of having exploited India, impoverished India. There's this ridiculous figure that gets touted of India accounting for 25% of world GDP, ignoring the fact that it's 25% of the population, therefore reduced by 1% of per capita GDP. So there's all this sort of absurdity. But I think one thing which, Professor Tirthankar Roy, for instance, brings out is the impact of cheap yarn on cloth production in India. So British factories are accused of flooding the Indian market with cheap yarn, but actually the cheap yarn fed cheaper weaving, and cloth production and consumption dramatically expanded in that period rather than were reduced. So again, an unintended consequence. On slavery, I would simply say that, again, I think it was totally incidental, but it's interesting that in terms of the compensation argument, it wasn't just big slave owners who were compensated. It was little old ladies in Cheltenham who owned half a slave, and it was their means of livelihood. So a lot of people just had a stake which had to be compensated in an age where private property was regarded as quite basic, and no government could have abolished slavery without compensation. So it's absurd to, talk about that being a burden. I would say that, there was, in terms of the coming back to the British relationship with India, Britain is accused of draining India, but I think what people forget in the equation is the movement of capital. So just to give you a figure, £23 billion in today's money was the flow of British capital to India over the period of colonial rule. And development economists accept that capital has to be paid for and you pay interest on it. And the interest that was paid was an annual average of 3.4%, which was less than the global interest rate. So British capital could have made more money by investing elsewhere. But it wasn't a drain on anyone, and it wasn't a zero-sum benefit to anyone. And, it amounted to an average of the payments, which were the home remittances, which were the payments for that capital, amounted to about 1.5% of India's national income, which was, tiny. So I'd like to end with another interesting statistic, which is, I'm sure you're aware that the British Indian Army supplied 2 to 3 million strong volunteer troops to Britain during both world wars. And this was paid for. What is not often recognized is this wasn't a free gift from India to Britain. Britain paid for it at independence, because the British government paid the Indian government for it, and the government of India had foreign exchange reserves of over £1 billion at independence, which would have been about £36 billion in today's money. So this was a payment for Indian services during World War II. It would be interesting to consider how that affected the British economy. Obviously, it enabled Britain to fight 2 world wars and win them. It enriched the Punjab in India, where most of the troops came from and, were well paid. I'm not sure how it affected the British economy, so I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Masani. And as we move on to the next stage, I'll ask questions to contributors, but do feel free to pitch in if you have thoughts. Actually, sticking with you, Dr. Masani, you bring up this figure that I think Shashi Tharoor has used quite a lot about India's percentage of global GDP was 25% before British rule. But by the end of British rule, it's about 2% in global terms. So even though its population has declined in relative terms, that's still a pretty miserable record from the perspective of a pro-growth administration, if that's what it was.
There are several reasons for that, and not so much to do with British rule, which stimulated the Indian economy. It was to do with the Industrial Revolution, which came to India a century after it had come to Britain and to Western Europe. So that exponentially, reduced the size of the Indian economy relative to the world economy. And the 2%, in 1947, how would you compare that with the 25% in 1600? And important to remember, the 1600 figure was declining well before the British arrived. So it was declining. 1600 was the peak of India's world GDP, declining after that because Indian manufacturers were declining after that. And so when the British took over, say, from 1750 onwards, it was a lot less than 25%.
Yeah, and interestingly also, I think from the work of Dr. and Broadbury, even in 1600, in per capita terms, India's GDP was only about 60% of Britain's in per capita terms. So it was there was still a relative gap, although this did increase. Turning to you, Dr. Bateman, one of the comments that people might initially make on your thesis that one of the big advantages that Britain had and Northwest Europe had was the relative emancipation of women compared to other parts of the world. Well, many people would say, women in the 18th or 19th century didn't have the vote. Their property was often locked up with their husbands. In what meaningful way were British women more liberated than women in China or the Ottoman Empire?
Yes, such a great question. And I think actually one of the best measures of how free a woman is, and still a good measure today, is to what extent she has control over whether, when, and who she marries. So for much of history, daughters have been married off by their fathers often to men might be double the age of their daughters. And the result is that they are then committed to produce child after child to domestic drudgery for performing unpaid labour, essentially, for their economy, producing the next generation. Now, what I think is one of the most surprising facts about the British economy in the centuries on the run-up to the Industrial Revolution is the average age that a woman got married, and this is first marriage, so this isn't second marriages, third marriage, was 25 or 26 years old. So young women, and this isn't just Britain, this was Northwestern Europe in general, young women typically left home as teenage girls and they went out onto the labour market. They performed paid work. Now, that might be in domestic service or it might be in agricultural labour, say as milkmaids. I mean, one of the great things that stimulated women's rights was cattle, cows, and all the dairy that came with that. So young women would go out to work. They might work for, say, 10 years. During that time, build up a pot of savings and decide for themselves whether, when, and who to marry. And actually, a good portion of British women decided not to marry because they had that freedom to do that. A good 10%, sometimes a little bit more, depending on what century you're looking at. And those that did marry were able to find a partner of their own choosing, a consensual marriage, and married once the two of them had built up enough of a pot of savings to start their own household, their own nuclear household. So women were not under the watchful eyes of their parents-in-law. They were in command of their own households. And this is what I argue in this book. So the seeds of the rise of the British economy. Because, I mean, I look at 4 or 5 different ways in which this helped the British economy. And one is that if women are marrying later in life, they're having smaller families. And those smaller families help to keep population under control. And that in turn feeds through to create a higher wage economy that inspires technological change, mechanization, that puts the capital in capitalism, as a Marxist might want to call it. So it's not cheap labour, it's expensive labour that drives that. Also, with these smaller, higher wage families, people can better afford to save. They can better afford to educate their children. They're having fewer of them, so they can afford to apprentice at least some of their children. And also the very fact that in this type of economy, that in order to get married, you have to make your own way in the world, set up your own nuclear household, that inspires a work ethic and entrepreneurism that other people have called the Protestant work ethic or the capitalist spirit. Because unless you work hard, take advantage of training opportunities and save, you simply cannot get married, you cannot have children, you cannot have a sex life in the way that perhaps most people want. Whereas in most parts of the world, people's parents look after that marriage decision for them. And so what happens to a young person, what happens to their future is much less dependent on their own individual effort and much more dependent on their extended family. So it's in those ways that I argue that women's freedom was particularly crucial for laying the seeds of the Industrial Revolution.
And presumably there's also a culture of women going out into the wage economy,
absolutely,
getting money, which is a big advantage for factories early on.
Well, that is really key because, in so many of these empires that I've mentioned, women were working. They were typically working in a way that was invisible to the rest of the economy. So it might be, say, spinning and weaving within their homes. It might be making pottery. So in a sense, CEOs of their own little household economy, their husband might be out working in the fields, and then your wife might be grinding corn, making pots in your hearth, and making cloth. And actually, cloth was one of the things that was most taxed by, for example, the Chinese dynasties in history. But that was behind closed doors. It was a kind of labour that women themselves didn't necessarily have full control over. It is that ability to get out of your family home and to engage in a paid form of labour over which you have full control as a woman that is important. Now, what's interesting is with some of the early factories in East Asia, one of the ways that recruitment took place was to go to the fathers of young women and essentially ask them to sell their daughter into labour into a factory.
Is this in the 20th century?
This is in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so you have women in factories, but it is their fathers that are getting their pay packet rather than the women themselves.
Right.
So I think, this is quite an astonishing, fact. Women have worked everywhere throughout history, but this ability for women in particularly northwestern Europe to have this control over their own financial independence. And I think, too much today we take for granted the idea that, one, women can go out to work, two, that they can keep their earnings, three, that they can be proud of that work rather than ashamed of going out into the workplace, and four, that they have the freedom to decide what they spend their income on. And all four of those things, all four of those aspects of economic freedom are things that societies and states have greatly tried to limit throughout human history.
But it was less limited in
Far
Britain.
less in Britain.
What? And I'll actually throw this out to the panel in general. What do you make of sort of Robert Allen's thesis that yes, it was high wages that were driving the Industrial Revolution because it meant labour's more expensive, which gives you more of an incentive to invest in experimental machinery, which is labour saving. But that this, in turn, was a kind of second-order effect of 17th century colonialism and trade.
Yeah. So this idea that Britain was actually a high-wage, not a low-wage economy, that has been trumpeted by actually my former PhD supervisor, Robert C. Allen. I did my PhD at Oxford under his wings. And it's really quite transformed the landscape of economic history, because what it tells us is that the Industrial Revolution didn't take place in a part of the world where you had cheap exploited labour. It took place in a part of the world where labour was a little bit more expensive. And I think that, there is a big debate going on right now about precisely how high wages were in Britain, how we calculate them, to what extent Bob Allen has, got his maths right. There is a big debate going on. But nevertheless, even adjusting the real wage estimates, there does seem to be something about Western Europe that stands out when we look at wages relative to, say, China, India, around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Now, what I think that Robert Allen has got wrong about this is the underlying mechanism. So he argues, as you say, that it was Britain's trade, and perhaps as a part of that, Britain's empire and colonisation that drove increased demand for labour in British port cities, and that created this demand-driven high-wage economy in Britain. Now, actually, I don't think that. I think it is women's freedoms. I see it in a much more supply-side context, that if you're looking at the population dynamics in your economy, if you're looking at your labour market, your demand and supply, the supply side is, if anything, more important. And it is the fact that women are getting married later in life, they're having smaller families, that feeds through demographically to reduce population pressure and to support a higher wage economy.
And I would just like to sort of also suggest that getting away from simple economic determinism, getting back to the impact that the empire had on these, both the status of British women and the status of women in the empire. But I think just looking at the status of British women, I think the empire was a huge liberating force, because, we all know about the fishing fleets that used to come to India, young women looking for husbands who were doing very well in the ICS, etc. But we know less about the women who actually staffed British services, say, in the colonies, in Africa, in India. My friend Margaret Macmillan did her thesis on women of the Raj, which was very much rescuing women from this very subsidiary role that was being given to them. And the empire was a hugely, liberating experience in terms of employment opportunities. You didn't have to, just get married. So I think that was, I come back to this fact that I think the empire had a huge impact on Britain culturally. And I think the Britain we know today and the whole British outlook on the world is very much derived from empire.
Can I just say, I think there are
very briefly
experiences as well. So if we look at, say, Indigenous women in the Americas, who have their babies taken off them and put into state orphanages, and there the daughters are taught, domestic skills to become housewives and so on. So I think there's a kind of mixed bag of experience.
Not consistent.
Yeah.
Dr. Goldman, I wanted to actually, moving slightly on from the supply side of things, I wanted to get back on one of your comments on the demand for British manufactured goods, which you said that slaves don't consume much, which is certainly, unfortunately, true. But isn't this really a case of the surplus sort of being transferred from one group of people to another, their owners, frankly? And also, isn't there an argument that the relative cheapness of plantation goods in Britain helped to stimulate a sort of consumer economy and drive this kind of industrious revolution, that people actually, because they had sugar that was reasonably affordable, people worked longer hours. We see this throughout the 18th century. People are working longer and longer hours precisely because there is something to consume, and maybe that's a product of the plantation economy.
Yes, no, I see the point you're getting at. I think the problem really is to think relatively. I think a lot of the work that's been done recently, which has tried to make the case for the importance of the slave economy and the empire and so forth, has dealt in absolutes. This is true of Maxine Berg and Pat Hudson's book, full of absolute figures, but not thinking relatively. If you think immediately of where British goods are going and in what volumes and the worth of these goods, then quite quickly you discover that the slave economy is not sucking in, is not consuming very much in terms of British manufactures. They're going elsewhere in much, much greater relative volumes. And Berg and Hudson, in the book they published last year on capitalism and slavery, have tried to make the case that not only did slavery produce cheap comestibles like sugar, but it also used up plenty of resources and exports coming out of Britain. And it's very difficult to make that. Similarly, yes, you can make something of sugar, which is obviously the main commodity being produced by the Caribbean islands and Caribbean slavery in general. But it's hardly a crucial element of the British Industrial Revolution. Now, if you wanted to, and one should, clearly you can make the relationship between cotton slavery and industrialization. Yeah. Now, that is a much, much more significant relationship. And it happens, of course, to be the case that by the time we're taking cotton across the Atlantic, it's coming from American states rather than what were until the 1780s, as it were, parts of the British Empire. And it obviously depends upon slavery. And it's, nobody could deny that Lancashire and hundreds of thousands of jobs depend upon cotton, but not sugar. Sugar is not that important. It's a luxury good. It makes significant alterations to the British diet and British dentistry for certain, but it's not. But it's hardly driving the Industrial Revolution, whereas cotton is. Nevertheless, just one point: when you think about cotton, and people again make an enormous amount about cotton going to Lancashire, slavery, the root therefore of industrialization and wealth and so forth. Always consider that far greater economic links exist between Britain in the 19th century and the American North than the American South. The American North is taking its capital, it's a debtor community, and it's taking its capital from London and British banks. And we are much more integrated into an Atlantic economy in the North, which has nothing to do with cotton and nothing to do with slavery, than we are, as it were, dependent upon a slave economy in the South. Far more is at stake when we think about the development of northern states than the South. And the consequence, of course, is that, as in the Civil War, we never intervene. I mean, it's thought by the Confederacy that, Britain depends upon cotton and the slave economy, we will intervene. But actually, the calculation is wrong.
Yeah. I mean, it does cause a pretty bad couple of years in 1862 and 63 when the South cut off cotton.
Yeah, there's a cotton famine and there are hundreds of thousands out of work. No argument about that. But Palmerston's government knows very well that intervention, breaking a blockade, recognising the Confederacy, will have far more deleterious effects on the British economy if the Union decide to default on the loans which we have made to them. And I simply make the point that, again, there is this image of a kind of an economy crucially dependent upon slavery. But there's much more to this. Britain's trade, Britain's capital flows and so forth are much more diverse than they are, as it were, dependent upon slave economies.
You also brought up Berg and Hudson's book on slavery, capital and industrial revolution. I wonder if we could actually bring in Kristian on this, because one of your criticisms of their thesis is essentially that some people have made money out of the plantation economy and out of the slave trade, but the military expenditure to protect that is so much higher that it's just not worth it. It's an expense on the taxpayer instead. But isn't their argument that most of this military expenditure is essentially offset because it's stimulating various parts of the economy, whether that's shipbuilding, making uniforms, supplying the navy, that sort of thing?
That is their argument, yes. It's very strange. They start by basically making my argument, saying, look, this is how much Britain had to spend on protecting the naval trade. It was super expensive. And up until that point, I'm thinking, well, yes, that's what I'm saying. And then they start saying, and this is what stimulated the economy. This is really a benefit. But in those terms, if you count the benefits of the slave trade as a benefit, and if you count the costs also as a benefit, then any project must be profitable. You could then probably also say, I guess people nowadays are defending HS2. Could also say, well, but it creates jobs for whoever makes the railway materials and the consultants and all of that. But this is the Frédéric Bastiat argument about the broken window, where somebody has their window smashed and the crowd says, oh, this is great. Now he has to spend money on the glazier, 6 francs, but this is extra income for the glazier. The glazier then goes out and buys a new suit, and this is how they stimulate the economy. Yeah, but if the window hadn't been smashed, that person would not have thrown the 6 francs away or buried them in the garden. They would have spent them on something, and that would have been someone's income, who would then also have spent it on something else and so forth. So, this is basically, you can say it's a crude Keynesian argument. You can, of course, Keynes would say if an economy is in a slump and it has lots of unused resources, then a stimulus which somehow activates the unused resources can be a good thing. But most of the time, an economy isn't in a state where you have tons of unused resources. Most of the time, resources are used for something. And so
this money that was being pumped into the Navy or the Army to defend Caribbean colonies could have been invested into the British economy directly.
Yes.
Rather than...
Yes. Yeah. It's a very roundabout way to say, well, let's demand lots of ships and uniforms, and then so that the tailors and the ship makers can spend the money. Why not just spend the money?
Yeah, or just reduce taxation, which Britain has, the second highest in Europe in the 18th century. Okay, brilliant. On that note, I think we can move on to question and answer from our audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I think we have a roving microphone. That's slightly odd. The man in glasses just there, he had you, the one looking round. He had his...
We can discuss it history, but a lot of the discussion is focused on comparison across place rather than time, with the honourable exception of Sargon of Akkad. I was just wondering if there isn't a powerful argument to be made comparing more over time. So Victoria Bateman was talking about relative wages versus cost of capital, but that change happens every time that there's a pandemic. You had that after the Black Death. That happens often through history. We've also, I think, been assuming that it's correct to date the Industrial Revolution to the late 18th, early 19th century. But, there's a lot of evidence for increased consumption in England in particular, going back to at least the 16th century and maybe before. which is entirely the wrong timing for slavery. So that just seemed like an angle that hadn't been picked up on.
Lawrence, do you want to have a go at that?
No, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it certainly used to be the argument that industrialization depended upon a very buoyant home market, and home demand was very important. And that from the 17th century, there's lots of evidence of the growth of a middle class, of a middling sort, who are consuming, who are buying products of all sorts. And this is crucial to the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. This is where Wedgwood finds his market in the mid-18th century, pots and pans and so forth. It's very interesting if you look at English wills and compare the 17th and the 18th century. What did Englishmen leave when they died? They left far more material goods in the 18th century than the 17th century. And you're absolutely right that this process begins really from the 1660s and the 1670s onwards. And the Cambridge Project on the History of British Demography showed this as well. As also, of course, demography tells us that the British population is growing. It's doubling in the 18th century. So your point is well made. Home demand from the late 17th century is a very crucial component of the story of industrialization.
Hey. Next question, the man in the blue jumper. Wait for the microphone, please.
Hello, I'm Sheldon Wilkie. I've got basically two questions, but they're very brief. The first question is, could you explain in more detail regarding capital formation? Where did the capital investment come from to fund the Industrial Revolution? And the second part of my question is, which countries did Britain trade with in Europe? Specific examples.
Okay. Do you want to take capital formation or anyone?
Well, I'm happy to say something.
Yeah.
All right, okay. Well, long ago, a man called T.S. Ashton, very famous economic historian of the old school, published a book on the Industrial Revolution, 1948, and he looked at 92 of the most well-known entrepreneurs of the industrialization period. And what he discovered, and it goes really to Zareer's point about culture being crucial, is that what distinguishes them is culturally they are, if you like, outsiders. They're not Anglicans, they're nonconformists, they're northern, they're provincial, and they're often just the sons of tradesmen or craftsmen who are tinkering and learning new technologies and new skills on the job. And where they get their capital from is really very local. I mean, they're not going to banks and getting loans. There aren't banks that want to support them, and there isn't that kind of national banking system. They go to their co-religionists in their chapel. They go to their kith and their kin, to their friends. And small amounts of capital are collected in that way and are used to sustain new developments and the foundation of factories and so forth on a small scale. So this is a very localized form of capital formation. And I think subsequent historians, Joel Mokyr comes to mind, have confirmed this idea. It's not a kind of Bank of England or large-scale banking enterprise that provides loans and capital. It's actually generated quite locally. Indeed, many of our banks actually grow in this way. Barclays is a Quaker bank that's put together in the 18th century on the basis of these kinds of kinship networks and links and so forth. Provincial banking is very important. So
Victoria and
just to build on that, and I agree absolutely with what you say. One of the things you find in, for example, northern newspapers in the latter part of the 19th century are adverts from local cotton mills, factories, in which they announce the saving schemes that they run. Now, they would run saving schemes for their own workers. So you could, sacrifice a part of your wage each week to be invested in the company that you work. But also, factories would run saving schemes for other people in the local communities. So you could, if you have a wedding coming up in a couple of years or something like that, then you could put your savings into a local company that then plough it into their own internal investment. So yes, you see this throughout, for example, Oldham newspapers in the late 19th century. Of course, today you couldn't have an industrial firm acting as a deposit-taking bank in that way, but that was going on behind the scenes in the 19th century.
Regulation gone mad.
Dr. Masani?
It's sort of emphasized the role of coming back to empire as a form of job creation. It was a hugely lucrative job market for the middle classes in Britain who aspired to sending out their sons to kind of gain distinction in the ICS, the Indian Civil Service. There was this college at Haileybury which produced the graduates for the East India Company. There was a lot of competition for that, and it was a hugely enriching factor. There were also, of course, the nabobs who came back with very large billions and set up some of Britain's most prominent country houses, which we visit today, were built on the profits of the nabobs. So I think, I would strongly recommend a book by my friend David Gilmour called The British in India, which actually looks at the lives of British men and women. Women figure very much in it, serving within the empire in different categories, ranging from anything from the police forces to the civil service to hospital services, medical services, all kinds of services that were being provided outside Britain. I think that had a hugely stimulating effect, both culturally and, I would imagine, economically.
But couldn't this also be a negative effect of empire, in that it's essentially an exporting of human capital, a sort of brain drain? If you're sending out the best you breed, as Kipling puts it, they're not sort of working in the domestic economy.
I could add something there. People are familiar with the painting by Ford Madoc Brown, The Laughter of Italy.
Yeah.
There's in the circular painting that did a class couple with their backs to on the deck of the ship, with their backs to the White Cliffs of Dover. Yes. And essentially what was happening was that there was a surplus of middle class people. It wasn't the brain drain, it was just there was too much brains.
So they had to find something to do. Elite overproduction.
But
anyway,
quite often, the role of people who were serving in India sort of rescued families from being quite indigent in Britain, and their profits, their salaries, their home remittances were ploughed back into the British economy.
I just asked you, sir, where do you think most of the emigrants from Britain went to in the 19th century? Which country?
I'm going to bow to your superior knowledge.
It's the United States. It's not the empire. I mean, perhaps overall the empire more or less equals the numbers who went. 8 million left these islands in the course of the 19th century.
There was a famine in Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. But most went, and that goes to the English as well, most went to the United States. Which simply makes the point that it's not just empire. It goes back to a point we've made earlier this evening, that one has to see Britain's trade in a global context, and it's not just the empire that we're trading with.
Yeah, great. Could we take 2 questions now, one from the gentleman up here and one from Jamie?
Michael Ben-Gad, City University. Michael Ben-Gad, City University. First, let me just mention that President Biden is Irish on his mother's side. His father's family. The Bidens are actually English, and they're English, and they left in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Robert Fogel made a similar point about the profitability for the plantation owners for slavery 40 years ago. Nonetheless, all of these arguments persist. I spent last week at a conference where I heard one speaker after another denouncing, basically making the argument that colonialism carries on to this very day, that the Western world is still exploiting these countries. The Eric Williams argument was made over and over again. So what explains the? I mean, I'm constantly being asked to decolonize my curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. So what explains the intensification of the cultural wars, given what we know? Why is it getting worse? It seems. I just ask Kristian, just as an aside, for the crude Keynesians, did you ever ask them if they actually want to double military spending now?
Okay. We'll on to Kristian first on that question on the Keynesians.
I suspect they would not be too happy about it, but would maybe say, well, the economy has somehow changed or whatever. We'll come up with some excuse. But on the question, why is this intensifying? Why are these arguments back? I guess that's quite clearly that in the last decade we had a revival of Marxism, anti-capitalism, and it's just found a new outlet in the BLM protests. That is what brought it back. That it's somehow been turned into this original sin story of capitalism. That this is just a way of denouncing capitalism, of saying capitalism was born bad. It was born out of exploitation, born out of plunder, born out of atrocities and misery. And this is the system that you guys are defending today. You're the baddies.
Yeah, but if I might add a point, I mean, my education in history in Cambridge in the late 1970s was reading article after article in the Economic History Review and comparing the arguments and the data and coming towards some sort of conclusion. It was hard going. It was a wonderful education in assessing historical argument. But I'm not sure that these days in history departments or economic departments or imperial studies departments, that kind of work goes on. I mean, part of the problem, this is a different issue, but it does play into your question, is that we have not pursued historical education in a broad sense with the rigour that we used to 40 and 50 years ago. And this is a consequence. People ignore it. I mean, they're not interested in all the work, all the scholarship, and all the detail and all the data. It's much easier to emote, and that's what we find.
I think we have time for one final question from Jamie. Sure. Okay. Oh, yeah. Wait for the microphone if that's all right.
Hi. So, Kristian, you brought up the counterfactual. So, compared to what? So, did colonialism enrich UK? Well, compared to what? And I've always thought that the interesting comparison is globalization at the same period, but without the force, without the guns, right? So you just go and trade, and if they like some of your ideas, they adopt them. You don't impose them on them, and So let's say globalization at that time, but without guns. And it seems to be an interesting question, which partly I'd like to put to Dr. Masani, because you've been quite positive about the effects of empire. So to what extent do you think the costs and benefits of the system would have been greater or lesser if we'd got the globalization but without the guns, right? So that's always, to me, the interesting question.
I think it's not just the guns. I think what empire brought, say, to a region like India was representative government, representative institutions, the rule of law, women's rights.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Yes, would they have adopted it if we hadn't forced it on them?
No, I think that there was an element of compulsion which made these things possible. I don't think in a simply globalized way, like we have today, those customs would have been adopted. I don't think India would have ended up as a democracy. So I think there would have been huge differences. How that would have affected the British economy, for better or worse, I think is speculative. It's like, looking at the Brexit rewards. I wouldn't, I think it's very difficult to quantify the benefits of an empire or not. We know there are many Western European countries which have done very well, as Kristian has shown in his article, without empire, and have done just as well as Britain. But I think it's very difficult to prove a negative. So I would be, and I think I would also emphasize, which is part of Britain's commercial and economic life, is the openness, the competition, the openness to the rest of the world. which I think did come with people living abroad for long periods, working and dying in large numbers in parts of the empire, doing very work that they were really idealistically committed to. There was a huge ideological aspect to this.
Yeah. On that point, actually, very briefly, Kristian, Alan Lester at the University of Sussex has criticised your pamphlet on the grounds that basically counterfactual history is completely irrelevant. We just need to ask, did slavery happen? Yes. Or did empire happen? Yes. And did the Industrial Revolution happen? And therefore your job should be to assess how one led to the other, not whether anything else would have been different.
Yeah, that's a very strange criticism, because in economics we do this all the time. We look at some economy that does very well in some respect, or very badly in some respect, and then we ask why that is. And of course, these economies do hundreds of different things. Not all of them can explain the success or lack thereof. And therefore, we try to disentangle the different factors, and you could call that talking about counterfactuals. But this is always the case when we ask, why did South Korea suddenly industrialize in the 70s or whenever it was? Or why did Hong Kong and Singapore start to take off? Or why did West Germany rebuild so quickly after the Second World War? Every time we do that, we ask, okay, they do millions of different things. Which factors explain that success?
Any question that involves causation has to involve, in some level, a counterfactual. Yeah. We do have time for one final question from Lord Roberts there at the back. So do please try to keep it very brief, and we'll also keep our answers very brief.
I will very much. Thank you. What a fascinating conversation. Congratulations. It's been great. I want to just ask you, we've talked about Western prosperity. Could we actually have a qualitative analysis on the difference between the British Empire, which we've spoken about so much today, and the Spanish Empire in the Philippines, the French Empire in Algeria, the German Empire in Southwest Africa, the Portuguese Empire, and so on? Is there a qualitative difference between the kind of imperialism that we were pushing post-1858 and the rest of the other European empires?
Well, Kristian, you address that somewhat in the book.
Yes, although I try in quantitative terms. Yeah, the Belgian Empire was clearly the worst example, but also purely in economic terms, the one that seems to have worked for them, but under very special circumstances. So they had a parliament which just refused to subsidize it and told the king, okay, you are the king. If you want to go and colonize somewhere, we can't stop you, but you have to pay for it yourself or raise your own funds. And then they were very rich in natural resources that were in high demand at the time. So a very unusual example that shows it is in principle possible to have a profitable colony, but probably you need circumstances that you can't easily replicate. And at the other end of the spectrum, the German Empire being the most clear-cut case of an empire that was in economic terms a total failure.
Right. So you're making the economic case for privatizing imperialism. Is that?
If you have to do it.
And finally, I just want to thank all of the panelists, and I think we can give them a round of applause. Thank you.